Good morning again. It is good to be back. It's been like 9 weeks or so, which is the longest I've been away from this place in a while. And I've started to feel it, I'm really glad to be back with you. I do have a joy that I wanted to share. Many of you have been walking with me and my family through my brain tumor diagnosis and surgery. And last week, my endocrinologist told me the blood work she saw was fantastic, and she kept cheering, and she said, "I'll see you in a year." So I'm grateful for that. So I'll be causing trouble for a while here. So I've always been a believer that everyone needs a hug around the neck and a kick in the behind at different times. And I think today is going to be both of those things. At least it feels that way to me. It's hard to believe, but it's been 3 years since we entered lockdown soon after the arrival of the coronavirus. And I remember sitting in this very room over the course of a couple of weeks as things grew more and more dire. I was here trying to write a book, trying to ignore everything that was going on, thinking, oh, it's all going to blow over shortly, until I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer, and people stopped showing up here. And I've been thinking about those first days and weeks, which of course became months and years. And I remember some things distinctly about that time. I remember going to 3 grocery stores in a panic as the shelves became more and more bare. I remember the uncertainty of the days, the unpredictability as our family's routine was interrupted and our normal was blown apart. I remember looking everywhere for bread, and there wasn't any bread, so I learned to bake, but then there wasn't any flour or yeast. I remember coming to this building and the key being covered with spider webs, and I realized no one had been here since the last time I was here. I remember finding an online source for toilet paper, and even though it was commercial grade, half ply, barely visible to the naked eye, I bought 100 rolls, and I began posting online if anyone needed them, and I went around like the Pied Piper of toilet paper. And I wonder what you remember about those days and weeks 3 years ago. As I'm talking about that, what do you remember? Just briefly share.
I remember trying to sew some cloth masks.
Trying to sew cloth masks, yes.
I remember going to the grocery store and everybody there wearing masks, but it being so strange because nobody would make eye contact. It was like such a...
Being at the grocery store, everyone suddenly in masks, not making eye contact, and the depersonalization of people, the emotional barrier that started to be created. What? Yes?
I had a pleasant thing. My daughter was staying and stayed on because she was scared to go back to New York. So I had her for like 2 months.
Oh, so your daughter was staying here, and she decided not to go back to New York, so you got more time with her.
Yeah. So.
Yes.
I remember like going to the store and seeing like the empty like shelves and like everything being gone.
Going to the stores and seeing the empty shelves and that being such a foreign thing for us. Yes.
Waiting in a long line outside of Home Depot for my turn to get into the store as people came out.
Waiting in line to get into a store and have to queue up like that. Yeah, that was.
I remember the empty roads during quarantine when everyone was at home.
Yeah, the empty roads during quarantine. And I remember every time I would see empty roads before that, I would make some zombie apocalypse joke, and then I didn't make that any longer, and you just saw the way that the world had stopped.
Automatically going up, even with the mask on, to hug someone, because that's what I do, and being pushed away.
Being a natural hugger, going to hug someone even with a mask and having them resist that. Yeah.
Everyone having to suddenly work at home.
Everyone having to suddenly work at home. So much if we look back on those first days and weeks, we realize the trauma that we've all been through together. And I also remember one other thing. I remember thinking that things were going to be different. We know the numbers associated with the last 3 years. Over 750 million cases worldwide, nearly 7 million deaths. 100 million cases in this country with more than 1 million dead. But as tragic as those numbers are, that might not be the worst part. The worst part is what can't be as easily measured, right? The worst part is what has happened to us collectively, relationally, societally, politically, all the fallout. And the sad reality is that the last 3 years have been an unprecedented opportunity for us to be transformed. All crises offer that. We had the chance to become a better version of our nation, and I think we failed. In what could have been a teachable moment, we learned how broken we really are. Collectively, we may have fallen to the occasion. We might have wasted this pandemic. And here's how. As a result of the last 3 years, we should have discarded our surface differences and remembered our deeper commonalities. We should have transcended the self-made barriers of politics and religion and moved from competition into collaboration. That hasn't really happened, has it? At least not from what we can often see on the surface. Inexplicably, America somehow managed to become more fractured and less united, even though we have experienced universal trauma. We have all walked through the empty rows. We have all been in those places of having our routines taken away, our normal stolen. But our tribalism has actually deepened in 3 years. Our prejudices have become more profound. The gaps between us feel like they're widening, which makes the stratospheric loss of life seem more wasteful. More wasteful than it would be if we had been moved by decency, if we had been grieving it properly together, if we had all been transformed as a result of what we all have walked through. And it hasn't always been like this, has it? Enduring catastrophe used to leave us better. We used to be able to find unity in tragedy. In past times of national consequence, in world wars and terrorist attacks and national disasters, we've been catalyzed into solidarity as a people, or at least we've been forced to have difficult conversations so that we could learn. The suffering has often driven us to one another, burned away the surface impurities of preference and affinity group, yielding something more refined and more beautiful than ever. 9/11 was probably a perfect example of that. Now, though a small minority of our people used that tragedy to perpetuate hatred of Muslims, or people who are from the Middle East, or people who are foreign to their eyes, most Americans, though, people of every religious worldview and every political affiliation and every nation of origin, stood in solidarity with the victims, and we leaned into the healthiest form of patriotism that saw us all as interconnected, that we're all in this really difficult life that we have never been to together. Many people in this country responded with the best of themselves. I just got the privilege of seeing Bruce Springsteen last night in Greensboro, and he sang a song called The Rising, and it was part of an album that was written in response to 9/11. And thousands of us sang that Come on up for the rising. Come on up, lay your hands in mine. And I thought to myself, I don't know the politics of all these people, maybe a lot of them. I don't know what they believe. I don't know what they do. I don't know who they support financially. I don't know how they voted. But here we are trying to recapture that time of being for everyone. So what has happened in the last 2 decades? How did we grow so embittered, so fractured, so unable or unwilling to find our similarities? How have we largely rejected the idea of oneness at the heart of the best of religion and the best of politics? I'm not sure we became anything in the last 2 decades that we weren't before as a nation, but I believe we have had ourselves revealed. Our hidden ugliness was uncovered, and it was uncovered really by our political system, if you think about it. In 2008, we elected our first African American president, and this overjoyed people who saw it as a marker that the arc of the moral universe in this country was bending toward justice. We saw progress in healthcare and marriage rights and women's rights. And with all these apparent victories, many of us slowly began to falsely feel that everything was trending upward and it would always do so. We may have gone to sleep a little bit. Gradually, in ways we can't quantify or perceive, many of us got lulled into complacency, or at least we started to lose the urgency for diverse humanity, which is a problem. Because at the same time, this president's arrival infuriated people whose tolerance for diversity could not abide a person of color leading them. And with everything, with the evolving legislation and with changing demographics and with civil and human rights progress, and with everything they felt that meant for them, they grew furious. And as this presidency unfolded, a network of religious institutions and politicians and media members began working overtime to undermine the systems that set democracy in place, hoping for the conditions to be right, to be able to coalesce around a figure who could embody the bigotry and fears and phobias and desire to control that they trafficked in and profited from. And in 2016, they found those conditions and they found that person. And suddenly, everything became a battleground. The southern border, public bathrooms, Starbucks coffee cups, prayer in schools, books about history, drag queens. And with a person in power now that required complete all or nothing devotion, and a collection of leaders in the church and in politics who had no interest in law or accountability, the virus 3 years ago arrived at the worst possible moment it could have, when we were all most vulnerable to schism. And so there were denials about the existence of the virus and the severity of the virus, and there were protests against school closings and masks and social distancing and vaccines. We've seen over the past 3 years the elimination of objective reality, the rejection of expertise and education. We've seen the rise of unthinkable conspiracies. Every single day, we have been pulled into incessant culture wars and given very little space in the middle where we could live in complexity and nuance and difference of opinion. It was and has been for a while now, are you against me or are you for me? And even those of us with a genuine desire to coexist with reasonable difference have had to choose sides, because the middle has either been silenced or it's disappeared, or we've just grown too exhausted to sustain the energy anymore. Extremism has caused tribalism to become the norm now. You've been in that for a few years. Maybe that's why you're so tired and irritable. Maybe that's why I'm going to eat the rest of that chocolate this afternoon. Now, it's obviously, friends, much more complicated than that. It's far bigger and more expansive and too long a history than just 2 presidents in 20 years. But in the short time that we have together, we can look broadly at the fact that we are experiencing a toxic, trickle-down enmity flowing from the highest places of leadership in politics, in the church, and in media. And that toxic, trickle-down hatred is flowing into our families and our friendships and our workplaces and our social media profiles. And we're all drowning in it. In the same way that wars are declared by generals and fought by citizens, tribalism is thrust upon us from on high, and we're facing the brunt of it, aren't we? Because here's the truth. We live in both systems and in stories. The stories are individual human beings. Original, unprecedented, once in history, never to be repeated creations with singular uniqueness but the same inherent value. Every life is a story. But these singular lives, they exist in communities and they exist in systems, in larger truths, in environments with rules and operating realities with barriers and supports that come to bear on those individual stories. And they either nurture or impede the stories. And the bad news for today is that, like tribalism, racism, or misogyny, or homophobia, these are systemic realities at some point. They're initiated by those in power, and it's virtually impossible for us to stop and change those systems. Yes, social movements and elections and unions and social media campaigns all give us places to leverage our shared influence to change things. But for the most part, we're not going to stop people who have made their money and secured their influence through tribalism from continuing to traffic in it. They're going to. The message is going to be, those people are your enemies. Fight them. Hate them. Devalue them. And that's, I guess, the frustration. That we can't figure out how to change what we've become because so much of it feels like it's beyond our control, right? So what can people of faith and morality and conscience do right now? How can we change something that feels so impossible? We can personally opt out of tribalism. We can allow our belief system and our moral compass and our spirituality to make us conscientious objectors in the war against our oneness. Author Tom Lynn says, we prefer our tribes to the others. We believe in the superiority of our tribe and we push back against those who threaten our group. You're thinking about people right now. Our tribes give us a sense of belonging, cooperation, purpose, comfort, and support. We nurture our tribes with myths and morals, facts and fictions to bind ourselves to one another. And he says, yet these ties that bind can also blind us. They can blind us to our limited imagination, to our prejudices, to our similarities, to our shared humanity, to our common hopes, to our greater good. Most of us don't imagine that we're tribal. But we form tribes around those who can identify the tribalism in others. When we can recognize people who fear the same thing that we fear, we form that tribe. When we know people who hate what we hate, our tribe forms. When we feel threatened by the same things, our tribe forms. The question becomes, what is the difference between authentic community and toxic tribalism? How can we tell if we're a tribe of affinity that is healthy or a closed echo chamber that will not listen to anyone anymore? How can we make sure that we are tribal for humanity? So what is the opposite of tribalism? It's Ubuntu. I shared it with the children today. You may not have heard it, you may have. It's an African philosophy that places emphasis on being human through other people. It has been summarized in the phrase, I am because who we all are, and I am because of you. Ubuntu declares that we find our identity in community with others, that our humanity needs to be reflected relationally. Bishop Desmond Tutu says this, Ubuntu is the essence of being human. It speaks particularly about the fact that you can't exist as a human being in isolation. It speaks about our interconnectedness. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming to others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, or he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs in a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated and diminished when others are tortured or oppressed. Now, here's the thing. We have natural Ubuntu for one another in this room, probably, because of a lot of assumptions we make about the things that we have in common. It's easy to have Ubuntu for those we agree with and like. But can we practice this interdependence and this oneness even with those who don't seem to value or recognize it? Can we practice Ubuntu even with those who want separateness? We can't necessarily change the systems that divide us, but what we can do is to fight this dividedness in the close and the small spaces of our individual stories, and in communities like this where we can actually change things. We can remember two weapons that we always have in the fight against tribalism. We have proximity and we have agency. We have proximity, we have closeness with actual human beings we disagree with. And then we have the choice as to who we show up as in those spaces. Indian writer Amit Ray says, universal human rights is the most precious jewel of humanity. Most of it is buried in the mud. It is our responsibility to uncover it and make a safe and beautiful world free from discriminations and inequalities. So this is what I'm facing for myself. It's the reality that there's a fine line between authentic community and insulated echo chamber. There's a fine line between passionately wielding our convictions and becoming intolerant to difference. There is a fine line between standing against those who build silos and building them ourselves. And I'm the line, and you're the line. The people who hold power and wealth at the top of a system are not going to do much to unite us. We have to resist what they tell us about one another. A couple ways maybe you can nurture Ubuntu and oneness and fight against tribalism. Continue to reach out to the stories around you. I'm trying to be a collector of stories, and not just stories that resonate with me, not just stories that I have a natural affinity for. So maybe you can continue to reach into the stories around you and remain curious about the other. Remain curious about the people you think you know. I see bumper stickers, I think I know who those people are. I see people watching a network, I think I know who they are. Probably don't. Something else you can do is become more aware of your tribal instincts, even if they begin with noble impulses. I know that my tribes form around wanting human rights for everyone and hating what is happening to marginalized communities. I know that's where my tribe begins, but I can't allow myself to be defined by the animosity I have for the people who are inflicting that damage. And what you can do is keep extending the invitation to those outside your tribe in the smallest of ways. I had a friend, we disconnected over politics, and he said, John, our friendship is more important than politics. And I said to him, actually, it's not politics, it's the fundamental things you believe about equality and the LGBTQ community and Muslims and people of color. Okay, but then he said, well, let's talk about that. And so I'm trying. Ubuntu ain't easy with him, but I want you to practice Ubuntu. Lean into the meaning that your life has as it connects to every other life. Because the last 3 years cannot have been for nothing. Because if the unprecedented wide-scale trauma of the past 3 years has shown us anything, it's that we may be beyond being transformed by a terrible circumstance, because what more terrible thing could happen? We're going to have to transform ourselves one story at a time.